So Pastor Jim Doman with the California Family Council, come on up.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you. Well, good evening. My name is Jim Doman, and with California Family Council, I'm blessed to work with pastors and people of influence in the state of California. And what our goal is to bring a biblical worldview to public policy. Now, Ryan mentioned kind of those big words, biblical worldview. What does that mean? Well, we champion three issues: life, family, and religious liberty. Life can range from what we're talking about tonight with suicide. That's a life issue. Depression, or even pro-life, from we believe that a baby is a baby at conception, and then natural death when someone naturally dies, not that the government or the state determines when, or someone else determines, and I'll talk about that, some legislation, whether you live or die. And obviously in the issue of family, mental health issues, that falls under that category as well. Well, this year, our state legislature, California State Legislature, has passed, or in the process is introduced, not passed, introduced 300 mental health bills. I mean, that's an enormous amount, and that's the issue we're talking about this evening with dealing with life and how it's a family issue. There's a couple of issues. So each month when we have a ripple effects, I will give an update of what's going on in the state legislature. Now, a lot of times we think, well, what does politics have anything to do with the Bible? And it's because our biblical worldview affects how we vote, who we put in office, and what the state is telling us we can or cannot do. There's a couple little life issues I'd like to talk about, and then I'm going to talk about the actually really good mental health bill that's in the current legislation regarding life. AB 2336. That means it's an assembly bill. This particular bill was killed in committee, but it would have protected gender selection abortions, meaning you can't abort a child if you don't approve of their gender. And some of you may not kind of realize how this is a life issue, but in many cultures and societies, women aren't valued. You know, like in China, they have a one child policy, and everybody wants boys. So if they find out it's a girl and they don't want them, you just abort them. And so we had a legislator to try to pass legislation to protect girls in the womb, and it was killed in committee. So we'll hopefully we'll have continue to fight that battle and have good legislation for really to protect women in utero. I talked a little about end of life. That's kind of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Assembly Bill 2139. We're monitoring it because it has the potential of, if you're unable to take care of yourself, someone else could make a decision on your behalf to terminate your life. Now, the wording isn't specifically that, but we're monitoring it because they can change the process as the bill goes through the committees and the Assembly and the State Senate. So we're monitoring that particular bill. I want to share it before I share this, before I share the good mental health bill, I want to share a life video. Now, this summer with ripple effects, there's some cards in the back you can pick up. We're talking about tonight suicide, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. We'll have an ex-gay panel next month. And then in August, Sean McDowell will be speaking on atheism. But hopefully if this works out and you like what we're doing, we'd love to continue these topics. But I want to share kind of an encouraging life video on the screen now for you. So that was Steve. And we did this abortion ripple effects. And we heard about women who had abortions. They shared their stories. And Steve just came up to me and said, hey, I have to tell you my story. I survived an abortion. I've never heard that before. I said, oh my word. I said, would you be willing to share what God's doing in your life? And he said, sure. He just went in the back room. We had a camera, and he did that. And so his video is on the app, Ripple Effects. You can share it with others. You can watch it again. And this evening, there'll be an opportunity. The church here has a green room. And if you feel led, you want to share your story about depression or suicide, or just talk briefly about it, we'd love to have you do that. Just come talk to me during the small group discussion time, and you can share your story. Or if our next topic, GLBT, if that's affected you or you have an opinion and want to share, we'd love to get you on video to share. And just like Steve did, and just shared, hey, this is what God's done and what he's doing. I just mentioned the app. Let's throw the app on the screen real quick, and I'll kind of walk you through some of this. If you went to the App Store or Google Android Store, like Ryan was speaking about earlier, type in Ripple FX, the letters FX. That will come up. You can hit open or download it. And then what it'll take you to is when you open the app on your phone, you'll see the logo and then events, promo videos, event videos, talking points, Facebook, and some other things. You can scroll through that. The reason you're like, why are you taking all this time to go through all this? The reason is I forget. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. There is some guy that shared a story that, maybe some person talks to you and says, I'm considering abortion, or, you know what, I made a plan about committing suicide. And you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? You can come here and have talking points and in a place that is free on any computer or whatever. You can hit talking points and find the topic. So if you were to go there, hit talking points. Right now we're building this, but we have atheism, homosexuality, pornography, and suicide and depression. You can click on there, and the topics Vince will be talking about tonight, the handout you get will be there. I lose papers, but digitally, if I have it digitally, or I can Google something, find it, and I'll know where to go. But that's a safe place where you're going to get a biblical worldview, not just Bible talking points, but what psychology, sociology, and other areas of academia talk about, and everything is cited. This just isn't somebody made this stuff up. This is all research, proven facts, statistics, and it's cited on each one of these. So I did tell you I was going to talk to you something positive about legislation, about our state legislature, and that's Assembly Bill 2198. And it's specifically dealing with mental health and suicide prevention training. And what the state is asking is that by the time in 2016, January, that all therapists, psychologists, MFTs, marriage and family therapists, educational psychologists, any type of person in a psychological field will have to have extended training in suicide awareness, prevention, and things like that. And I was actually, when I read this bill, I was like so encouraged that our state is doing something positive to help people. And kind of with that to say, I'm going to invite up Pastor and Dr. Vince Beresford to talk about suicide, depression, and mental health. Let's welcome Pastor Vince.
All right, good evening. I had the privilege, I serve as the executive director for an organization called ChildShare. And what ChildShare does is we go and we connect and partner with different churches, and we find families for kids who are in the foster care system to either foster or adopt. And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about that and why I'm so passionate about this topic, because they really go hand in hand and they're really part of my story. My mom had me when she was 19, ran away from home. I was born in a shelter in Pasadena, and right after I was born, I went right into the Los Angeles County foster care system and hopped around from house to house, and then my mom eventually went back home, and then after some consultation with her parents, my grandparents, they decided to go try to find me, and evidently it turns out that it was a difficult task because I had hopped around so many homes to try to find this kid. And ultimately they were able to find me, and I was reunited with my mom, and I wish I could tell you it was a great situation, but it really wasn't. And I just went into a pretty abusive situation where really for the next 10 years, by the time I was 10 years old, I had seen 2 murders firsthand. I had seen sexual abuse. I had seen drug abuse. I had been beaten up multiple times by grown men, different folks over the years. And it just had gotten worse and worse and worse. One of the things that I've learned since then is that children who are in foster care suffer what they call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, at twice the rate of U.S. war veterans. And I begin to realize and I begin to understand at a very early age the idea or the concept about depression and how that plays out in your life every day. You fast forward a little bit more, my father eventually was killed up in prison up in Folsom. My grandfather died of alcoholism. I was sent to military school in 7th grade, got kicked out of there, went back in the public school system, and from 8th grade and 9th grade, I just jumped right in and started doing what was everything was around me, was just getting involved in drugs, selling drugs, taking them, and I was knee-deep in that system, and a friend of mine kind of invited me to go to a camp. Now, a couple of things he didn't tell me about this camp. One, that it was a Christian camp. And two, that his uncle was a youth pastor and they forced him to go to camp with him every single year, and he just didn't tell me that. And so through the course of that week at this camp, I had this encounter with this God, and I started learning things like, people were like, well, weren't you afraid to go to hell? No, I mean, really, I wasn't afraid to die. I wasn't afraid of hell. I wasn't afraid of any of that stuff, which really messed up some people, because when you come from a type of background like that, there's different things that get you. And those things weren't, because you had to accept that to live where I live and do what I was doing. But all of a sudden they started talking about a God that will never leave you and never forsake you. And to a kid who had all kinds of abandonment issues, I got my attention. And all of a sudden he talked about Jesus praying to his heavenly Father and calling him Daddy. And that blew my mind when I began to think about God as my dad. And it was there at this camp that I had this radical encounter with Christ, and I was kind of one of those stories for all my life where I've been asked to go to churches and speak, and I was a kid that was on drugs and all this stuff, and then I was a Christian, and then I was doing all these great things, and I was a good athlete. But I want to tell you quickly about my senior year, because my senior year things had gone really well, and I had struggled in school, but I was getting by. And by this point, I had got a couple scholarship offers for football and for track and a couple other things. And I had my choice of which sport to play, where I wanted to go to school. And then right in the middle of that, I failed government, which I don't recommend doing. Don't try to do that your senior year. Not a good idea. And in an instant, every chance that I felt like I had for a scholarship was gone. And I just remember over the next course of the next few weeks and next few months, just kind of sinking in and really struggling, and really for the first time walking around really honestly thinking about taking my own life. Because for me, I grew up and it was like every time I'd show up to football, every time I would show up to some other event, everybody else would show up with new cleats and new gear and new school clothes at the beginning of the year, and it seemed like I showed up with the same old swap meet stuff that I had year after year. Every summer I would see my friends go out and they would go like motorcycle riding with their parents and go camping and go water skiing. And I would just live at home with my grandma. And I always felt like I was the kid who was always swimming upstream, and I always had to overcome, and I always had all the odds against me. And I felt like by the time I got to my senior year, this God thing made a huge difference in my life. And then when I felt like everything had shut down, I got to a point saying, you know what, this isn't worth it. And I think I'm supposed to say that, after I became a Christian, I became stronger, and I had no fears, and I never had any problems. But that was the thing, because I remember feeling so much guilt and so much shame as a Christ follower, having all these feelings like, I don't want to do this anymore, and never understanding the idea about this piece of depression, to understand that what I was suffering from wasn't something that was a feeling or an emotion. It was a disease. And can I tell you, probably one of the most misunderstood things in our culture right now is this idea of understanding depression. Because depression, clinical depression, and oftentimes we use it, it's like, oh, dude, I was so bummed I failed that test, I was so depressed, And we use those terms to describe sad feelings, but by definition, the term depression, the clinical term depression, is not an emotion or a feeling, it's a disease. And if you walk away with something tonight, I hope you understand that point. Because for those who are in the church, sometimes we like to or try to over-spiritualize something. And if depression really is a disease, and it's a chemical issue, and we're going to talk more about this, whether it be talking about lowered serotonin and norepinephrine levels in your body, then in the same way where you probably wouldn't go up to your friend who has diabetes, and if they're taking insulin for a meal, you probably wouldn't go to them and say, bro, you just got to have more faith, dude. You got to read your Bible more. You just pray more. You don't have to take those shots. But yet lots of times, all of a sudden we start talking about mental health and mental health in the church, it all of a sudden gets really touchy. And it's kind of awkward. And the reality is because most of us just don't know what to do with it. And we don't know where the spiritual part is, where the physical part, where the chemical part. And I want to talk to you tonight about that, because I think that piece and understanding that dynamic can be the part where you and I can begin tonight by partnering to save lives. For many years before this, I've been a part of an organization called the With Hope Foundation. And the With Hope Foundation was started in 2005 when this young lady, Amber, at 14 years old, went into a bedroom on a late start Wednesday morning and shot and killed herself. That was how suicide came into the Craig family. But in the aftermath of that tragedy, they begin to study, they begin to read, they begin to ask questions, they begin to delve into this awkward, weird, mushy topic that we're talking about suicide and depression. And to their dismay, they begin to realize that there had been signs and symptoms all around their house all along, but they didn't know what to look for. And so you can imagine for a family who's grieving the loss of a beautiful young child, a child who had almost straight A's, who as a freshman in high school was the starting goalkeeper in varsity, and on the outside she was the girl that everyone else wanted to be, so they thought. But see, on the inside she had a secret. She had a struggle, and that struggle was depression because she didn't know how to reconcile this God that she was learning at church, and all the time she prayed for him to take it away, and the way she was feeling, and she finally came to a place where she never got those two reconciled because she didn't really get the help that she needed. Her parents didn't understand what was going on there and ended up taking her own life. And to make an already tragic situation even more difficult, one by one, many of Amber's friends began to come forward to tell their parents that they knew that she was thinking about it, that they knew that she was talking about it. Because I want you to hear this, because you realize that 90% of all suicides, that person told somebody else before they did it. And so the one piece, the one message that the With Hope Foundation talks about, and I still love it, I'm on the board there, is probably one of the most important messages, and honestly, please hear this. If you don't hear anything else that I say, just remember this. If we understand that 90% of all people who are going to take their life are suicidal, tell somebody before they do it, then simply, if you and I would just remember to not keep that secret, that this is not a promise you want to keep for a friend. And as soon as you identify that, as soon as you see that posting, as soon as you see some of that where they infer it in their Instagram, in their Twitter, in their Facebook, or whatever the case may be, as soon as you see that, you don't sit on that and hope for the best and hope that you see them at school the next day. That you go and immediately connect them. And it doesn't mean, I hope you are relieved today that you don't feel the need to become a counselor or become a pastor or become anybody else other than a great friend that loves them enough to get them to connected to somebody that can help them. And if you leave here just with that message, then you and I are already in the partnership of saving lives. I want to introduce you to Annette Craig. Annette Craig is the founder of the With Hope Foundation, and she's Amber's mom. And I want you to hear the story I want you to hear her story as she talks about Amber and the foundation of this organization. And I think if you understand, you can catch the message she's trying to communicate. You really kind of get the essence of what we're trying to communicate tonight. So this is Annette Craig. So it was really out of that loss that this foundation was started. And I do want to pause just before we go any further, because one of the things that I've learned talking about this for the last 10 plus years is whenever I get a chance to talk about this topic, depending on your background, depending on your experience with this, lots of times it hits a lot of different people in different ways. And so let me just clarify one thing before I move forward. If this is something that has hit you deeply, if this is something that has traumatized you or your family, please hear my heart tonight and say, my goal is this, that I would partner with you, that you would join me in prayer here tonight, and that you and I would do everything that we can do in partnership to make sure that nobody has to experience what you've experienced. That's my goal. That's the goal of this foundation. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's the goal of this church. And I know that's the goal of Ripple Effects, of wanting for us to join together and really pursue and becoming the kind of men and women that God wants us to be. And so I wanted to kind of preface that. Take a look at this snap, or this picture, I should say. If you know the name Charles Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon was what many people would consider like a patriarch or a founding father of the Christian faith. He has written a bunch of things over the years. Obviously, he's an older gentleman no longer here with us on earth. But one of the things I show you this is because here's this person who left an incredible, indelible mark on our world. And yet he was a man of God, and he struggled with depression. And the Apostle Paul talks about having what he referred to as a thorn in his side. Now, we don't know exactly what that was, and I'm not inferring that I think that was depression or anything else, but I know lots of times, sometimes all of us have different challenges in different ways, and for Charles Spurgeon, it was a piece of depression. When we first started doing this many years ago, I talked about Rick Warren and his honest and some of his struggles, but now it's even more poignant if you know the story where he lost his son to suicide recently. And we've had some fantastic conversations talking about training and equipping and challenging people within the church to want to make sure that we're hitting this thing in a head-on way. Another side point is one of the things that I've discovered over the years is oftentimes, especially when I get a chance to talk about this at a church, versus, because lots of times we'll go into schools, we'll work with, pretty much anybody who's willing to listen to us and wants to get trained in this, we'll go talk to them. But whenever I go into a church, there's always seems to be struggles and stumbles and problems and things and sound systems that don't work and stuff, because I really do believe that our battle against sin is not a battle against flesh and blood. I think Satan absolutely hates the fact that you and I are here tonight hitting this topic head on. Because if he can keep it just one of those awkward behind-the-scenes things that nobody really deals with, then all of a sudden it's a lot more easy for him to be effective and to pull people away. But when the people of God join together and they deal with it head on and they said, no, this is not God's best. There is better for us, better for you, better for me, better for our friends that struggle with this. And it's not something that needs to be so debilitating. But I want you to take a look. Look at this. Look at some of these quotes from the book of Job, if you remember the story, whose name is almost now synonymous with troubles. But look at some of his quotes that we could read from the text of Job. He talks about, I cannot eat for sighing. I hate my life. Day after hopeless day. My heart is broken. My groans pour out like water. Depression haunts my days. My weary nights are filled with pain. I cry to you, O God, but you don't understand me. And one of the things that I love about the Bible and that God including that in there is because this isn't a surprise to him. This is not something that's happened in the 21st century and suddenly. And so we really have a God who loves us and loves you and me more than we can even put into words, and who's been challenging and walking alongside of his kids, you and I, since the beginning of time. You know, right now, that according to the World Health Organization, depression is the leading cause of disability in the world. Right now, depression is at an all-time high, and there are more people who are struggling from depression than any other time in history. Right now at our time. And I wish I could say it's been plateaued, but that number continues to rise. And whenever I talk to some people about different decisions and culture and all these things, and I'm like, okay, well, we are very progressive, if you want to use that word, but how is that working for us? And we watch things like depression continue to rise all the time. Only about 1 out of 3 teenagers suffering from depression will seek help in the United States. That means 66% of teenagers who are suffering from clinical depression won't get help for it. And hopefully the knee-jerk reaction and knee-jerk questions you have, as I did, is why not? Why would somebody not suffering from clinical depression not want to get help? And I'm going to suggest 2 ways and 2 reasons. One is I think there's a misunderstanding about what depression is. Because if depression looked the same for everybody, if everybody was depressed, was sad, and wanted to sleep in all the time, and wasn't motivated, and there was one way, but here's the challenge in all this stuff that we're talking about, is that depression looks different for different people. And for a young man who's maybe 16 or 17, depression for him could look like he's always on edge, he's not sleeping very much, everything ticks him off, he's mad all the time. And most people wouldn't look over and go, oh, that dude's got depression issues. They'd be like, that guy's got anger issues. And so depression looks different for different people, and that's, I think, one of the reasons. I think the other side of that is there's a stigma to depression.
let me do this. Let me pick on somebody. What's your name? George. All right, so let's say George is walking to church here tonight, and he's excited and he's coming, and while he's walking over in front of Home Depot, this big commercial truck doesn't see him, and George goes down. Bam! Dun, dun, dun. George's leg's not looking good. But you know, George is committed to be here. He's like, no, I made a commitment. My wife's going to meet me there. I'm going to be there. And all of a sudden, as he's on the ground, the crowd begins to gather around. And to everyone's amazement, George grabs his leg and he stands up on his good leg. And he starts walking away. He's like, where are you going? He's like, I'm going to church. And so he's walking across the parking lot, dragging this bum leg, and he finally gets here in the front. And while he's sitting in the front row, he's like, and his wife is like, honey, your leg, it's pretty much, you should probably go to the hospital. You need to take care of that. And George is like, no, it's cool, I got it. And then the pastor comes over, he goes, I'd really appreciate it if you stop bleeding all over my carpet. You know, we probably should take care of that. And if you saw a situation like this, what would you think of George? Would you think, man, that guy's cool? Probably not. You'd be like, like Homo's got issues, right? And here's my point with that. Is because if we're talking about somebody having a broken leg, you'd be like, well, of course he would go get help for that. Of course he would. I mean, you would think less if you'd be like, that guy has problems if he didn't go get something as obvious that taken care of so his leg would work right for the rest of his life, hopefully. But I can tell you how many people that I talk to almost on a daily basis, and they say, Vince, I'm so sick and tired of feeling like this. I'm so sick and tired of going through this. I'm like, well, man, let's get you connected. I know some people that can totally help you. You don't have to be like this. You don't have to live like this. No, that's cool. I got it. What? Because you and I live in a culture where if it was a leg, you go and get help right away. But all of a sudden, if it's not physical health, we start talking about mental health, then all of a sudden there's another stigma that comes with that. And I think that's part of the challenge, and that's one of the reasons why we have so many teens. And here's why all that's a big deal. So catch this. Right now, depression, all-time high, rising all the time. Out of that depression, 2/3 of those teenagers that are suffering from clinical depression will never get help, and here's why all that's a big deal. Is because untreated depression is the #1 cause for suicide in the U.S. You really can't talk about suicide and suicide prevention without understanding depression, and even what you might even want to call depression help or depression prevention, because those two things go hand in hand. Researchers estimate that 1,000 teenagers will attempt suicide every day in the U.S. You begin to multiply that by a month, you're looking at over 30,000 teenagers every month attempting suicide. About 36,000 people kill themselves in the U.S. This stat has actually increased. We're actually about 38,000 people killing themselves in the U.S. every year. And to give you an idea of that number, imagine going to the Honda Center to watch the Ducks lose. Sorry. And can I get a win? No, wrong place for that. But imagine going and watching. Well, you're looking at a Ducks game. You're looking at about probably 16,000, 17,000, 18,000 at capacity. Imagine the Honda Center filled up twice a year. And that many thousands of people die by their own hand in our country every year. I mean, I hope you're starting to get the magnitude of what it is that we're talking about. Nearly 1 million people worldwide will kill themselves this next year. About 3 to 5% of teenagers will experience clinical depression. That ends up being about 1 out of 25 teens. And for every completed suicide, there's about 100 to 200 attempts made that no one ever hears about. Well, oftentimes when someone commits suicide, oftentimes we'll get a phone call and come in and want to talk to the students or talk to the teachers or talk to parents or talk to all of them, and we'll do whatever we can in that situation. But for every suicide that we hear about that makes the paper, there's over 100 to 200 attempts made. And statistically, I've heard the alarm, there are very few high schools in the nation where there's not an attempted suicide, and probably multiple times every year at every high school. But we just don't hear about it. The kid stays home for a couple of days. I was sick. They come back to school. No one really knows. Now, I'm thankful for that. But there's the challenger of thinking just because somebody attempts it doesn't mean they're going to succeed at it. Look at some of these stats. Let me jump through these pretty quick. Suicide is the third leading cause of death for ages 15 to 24. It jumps up to the second leading cause of death for college-age students. Fastest growing age group for suicide right now is middle school. We're doing more and more presentations and training at middle school. A person dies from suicide every 14.2 minutes in the U.S. And about 1 out of 5 high school students will actually think about suicide. This is what I think a piece is huge, because I can tell you from somebody who walked around the hallway of his high school contemplating suicide, it's a pretty lonely place to be. You're pretty convinced that when you're there, you're the only one who thinks like that. And one of the reasons why I want you to see the stat, because I want you to pass on, I want you to communicate to, and I want you to have, for us to help as many people understand that this is part of the reality that we live in. And so if somebody gets there, you know what? They're not a freak, they're not weird, they're not crazy, and sadly, they're in good company. And when someone understands that they're really not the only one, the potential and the ability that they have to come forward to talk that out, to get help, really begins to increase. About 1 out of 12 college students actually has a suicide plan. And so if I was going to, let's talk about this plan piece. So imagine this right here. This is the road to suicide. And if I'm going to begin, kind of go on that road to move towards suicide, my first step that I would jump on would just say, I'm starting to think about it. So 20% of high school students, 1 out of 5 students, at some point during high school will step on that road and begin to think about it. But if you, and here's a coaching part, if you ever talk to somebody, if you ever find out that someone that you know is thinking about suicide or talking about, see them post about it, anything like that, first question you want to ask them is this: do you have a plan? Do you have a plan? Because if they answer that and how they answer that, that could lead you to the other questions. If you have a plan, do you have the resources to get the stuff that you need? Do you have the opportunity? Can you get to the place? Do you get the equipment? I mean, whatever, and you can find out some of those things. But basically what we're saying is, if they step on, they start thinking about, that's the first step. But if you talk about somebody who has a plan, that means they're pretty far down this road. That means when we're talking about somebody's walking around with a suicide plan, I mean, not that you want to take any part of the journey not serious, but this is not a time where you want to mess around. And maybe that's why you begin to make the connection. If 1 out of 12 college students is walking around with a suicide plan, we could probably understand why it's the second leading cause of death for college-age students. One thing that just happened recently, do you realize that for the first time in history, there are more teenagers that die from suicide than from automobile accidents? And that's never been true until these last couple of years. More teenagers and young adults die from suicide than from cancer, heart disease, AIDS, birth defects, stroke, pneumonia, influenza, and chronic lung disease combined. A recent survey of young people said they would tell a friend before they committed suicide. And again, all these things we're talking. And one of the reasons why we like to go talk with students, especially, quite honestly, I mean, we love to talk to parents, we'll talk to pastors, we'll talk to anybody. But one reason we talk to teens, because, when that teen tells somebody, guess who they tell? Who do you think? Their friends. They're probably not going to tell their parents, probably not going to tell their coach, probably not their pastor. The first people are going to find out are their friends. And so the most important people that we can train and be equipping to say this is not a secret you want to keep for a friend is the teens. Because and they really are and have almost the greatest potential to help this thing we're talking about. Take a look at some of these faces. You might recognize some of these faces. These are all people who would be public figures who have been honest about their bouts of depression. But if you see some of those things, then you realize that, actors like Heath Ledger, who died in the middle of filming the biggest movie of his life. Now, while there's some discussion on whether his overdose was a suicide or an accident, the thing that we do know is that he struggled deeply with depression. And as he was using that masking agent as a suicide solution or a numbing agent, we don't know. What we do know is he's gone now. But not only do we have celebrities who have been honest and open, you look at some of the black and white pictures, you look at some of the key figures in history who have also been honest and open about their bouts with depression. People like Abraham Lincoln, Richard Nixon, Teddy Roosevelt. But not only do we have celebrities who are being honest and open about their depression, which is a good thing, but we also have celebrities who are honest and open about their suicide attempts. So whether it be Ken Griffey Jr. talking about the pressure of growing up with a sports celebrity dad and all the pressure of getting to a place where he attempted suicide because he couldn't handle the pressure anymore, so he felt. And you've got all of these different dynamics, and people like Frank Sinatra, Nadia Comaneci, the first gymnast to ever score perfect tens in the Olympic Games, Judy Garland, who played Dorothy on The Wizard of Oz, and Johnny Cash, and you see all of these dynamics in play and realize that there's some, we're thankful that people are still around. But they're able to, but this is just how relevant we have, luckily, and I think it's a healthy thing, the more that we see people having conversations and being honest and open about the depression, even suicide attempts, the more we're going to have some of these conversations about it, and the more people we're going to be able to help. Here's some celebrities who didn't survive. One of the ones that hit me really hard was Junior Seau. I've had some privilege to interact with him. And I know that he is working with the chaplain over there for the San Diego Chargers. And if you don't know anything about him, he was an all-pro linebacker for San Diego Chargers, came from USC. and he suffered what was called post-concussion syndrome, or PCS. And it's an issue that's sweeping across the nation now, and for the first time, people are beginning to step back. Do you realize that there are more lawsuits now in the NFL than any other time in history? Because as guys are getting out of the NFL, they're struggling with this PCS, post-concussion syndrome, and they're realizing the depression piece and all the other elements that came after that, and there was not a lot of protection or warning or anything for them, and so they're having these conversations that are going on. And it's important to understand because we got a lot of examples of people that didn't get help as well. Over 80% of people, or about 80% of people who have attempted suicide will actually attempt it again. People who have been physically, emotionally, sexually abused. One of the other huge pieces I think we've got to talk about is the sexual abuse piece. I mean, statistically, do you realize that right now, on average in the United States, by the time a woman reaches adulthood, that 1 out of 3 women will experience some form of sexual abuse, and 1 out of 6 guys by the time they reach adulthood? It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how that would make someone struggle, and that can turn into some depressional type of issues. If you've had a family member commit suicide, we tell students all the time, make sure find out your family history. If you've had an uncle, if you've had a grandpa, if somebody like that has committed suicide in your family in your past, and it doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to commit suicide or that you're going to be depressed, but if you ever get to a place where you begin to experience some of those symptoms and you're able to identify and you can connect the dots, it's going to be so much easier to get you help. And so it doesn't have to end like that. You don't have to experience some of those things. My mom is a perfect example. My mom's struggled with mental health issues ever since I can remember. And this next one, when they talk about alcohol and drug problems, I really believe that one of the jokes was that every time my mom would come out of rehab, the joke was how many minutes it would take her to go right back into doing what she was doing before she went into rehab. And what I really believe to this day is that my mom, her problem was depression and mental health. And one of the symptoms of that problem was the masking agents that she hid by taking, PCP and meth and alcohol and everything else that she was taking to try to deal with those issues. So she would go into rehab. They would clean her up off of whatever it is or everything for a period of time, but they only dealt with the symptom of the problem. And they never fixed the problem. And so she just kept in this lifelong cycle. And can I be honest with you guys that my mom right now, if you ever been to LA and you saw a bag lady pushing on a shopping cart, one of those ladies is my mom. And we live in a culture where the state won't let me do anything because she doesn't want anybody to help her. She doesn't let her family go in. And quite honestly, I have no idea where she is tonight. Every time the phone rings with a number that I don't know from the Los Angeles area, I always wonder, is this my mom? And I've watched mental health destroy her life. And I've got a 9-year-old girl that she's met once. And my kid, and you know how hard it is? I've got a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 9-year-old, and they could probably count on one hand how many times they've met my mom. And it's part of the reality of having a ringside seat to watching mental health demolish people's lives. There's lots of myths to what we're talking about today. Myths of asking someone, are you thinking about suicide? I mean, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to go up and ask them that because if they weren't thinking about it and asking them that question, I'm going to plant that seed in your head. Can I just tell you this? I've and this is not something to brag about, I've interacted with so many people who have been suicidal and been in some pretty horrific situations, and thankful that many of them have turned out really well. But never in my life have I heard someone who went to a friend and said, hey man, how you doing, bro? I just noticed you got a lot of stuff. You're getting hit from all sides. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about hurting yourself or anything like that? And you know what I've never heard? That person's response going, suicide? Huh, that's a good idea. I hadn't even thought about that. I mean, you're not going to plant a seed in their head. But what you can do, you may start a conversation with them that no one else has started. You may start a life-saving conversation with them when they see, and you could look in their face even if they may not answer you, and you could tell that you hit a chord with them. And now you just have this invitation now to go in and help them get help. And let me say this just as we're talking about this stuff. I don't want to pretend that if you have somebody struggle with suicide and you're going to get them help, every once in a while you'll have somebody going, you know what, you're right, I need help. Please take me to get help. Those times happen, and I hope if you're ever in a situation, that's what you get to deal with. But oftentimes, you know what happens? You say, I need to get you help. I'm going to tell somebody. And if you tell anybody, you blankety, 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 blank and blank and blank and blank. You could probably fill in the blanks, right? That was a joke. Then it's probably going to be one of the hardest things you will ever do in your life. And I don't want to downplay this, and I don't want to pretend this is going to be easy, because if you're in that situation and that's your best friend, and they're trying to do everything they can to get you to promise not to tell anybody, but you love them enough to say something along the lines of, look, I can't keep that promise for you, and here's why. Because your life is more important than our friendship. Because your life is more important than our friendship. I would rather have you alive and not be my friend than be dead and be my friend. And that's not a secret I can keep for you. But you know what I found out, and I see it time after time after time, when normal people who don't feel strong enough, who don't feel smart enough, who aren't Christian enough or anything else, and they go and get their friends help, and after they've been cussed at and screamed at and hit and whatever else maybe come out of that situation, that you fast forward a few months, maybe a year, and that friend whose life has been saved comes back to that friend and says something and I've heard this so many times. You were the only one who cared enough to do that for me. Nobody else did for me what you did, and I'm here today because you cared enough to get me help. And I'm not going to pretend for 1 second that that's an easy road. I promise you'll never regret it. And neither will they after they get help and they continue to move forward. They think lots of times suicide just happens without warning. But as we talked about, 90% tell somebody before it happens. People who don't talk about suicide probably won't do it. You know, if they really wanted to do it, then they wouldn't just talk about it, right? They would just do it. But as we know, most everybody talks about it. It's about this. So understand this, like people who are suicidal, the goal of a suicidal person isn't to kill themselves. This is going to sound strange, but stick with me. The ultimate goal of a suicidal person isn't to kill themselves. The goal of a suicidal person is to get the pain to stop. And so what happens is it's almost like if you took a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi or something, and then you kind of begin to shake it up, and you shake it up, and you shake it up, and this pressure is building and building. Well, what happens for people kind of healthy, in a healthy situation, we all deal with pressure, we all deal with pain, we all have some kind of that element in our life, and then we have these things in our life, whether it be exercise or running or sleeping or whatever the case may be, where we release the top off that bottle and some of the pressure is released, and it's like, okay, this has been a good weekend. I'm ready to go back to whatever I'm doing again. But for someone who's suffering and it's a chemical issue and not a situational issue, and that pressure builds and it continues to build and it continues to build, and you start hearing things like, I don't know if I could do this for much longer. I'm so sick of feeling like this. I feel like I'm losing my mind. And it's just that building. And because they don't understand. But the reality is, if they're talking about it, they most certainly, make no doubt about it, 90% of people will talk about it before they attempt it. Remember that we're talking about the main goal of a suicidal person isn't to die. It's to get the pain to stop. And most teens' suicides, one of the myths is they occur at night. the majority of teen suicide happen between the hours of 2 and 6 p.m. Right in between when school gets out and when mom and dad get home. And that's why I tell students all the time, if you've got a kid who you know is struggling and they failed a test, or they broke up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, or you watch and everything's been hitting them and you can just see that they're just kind of at a breaking point and that bell rings at the end of the day, that's the day to connect and go, hey man, what are you doing after school? Let's go hang out. And it's like, man, I just want to be by myself. Well, that's cool. Well, can I be with you then while you're being by yourself? What? Oh, yeah, you don't need to be by yourself, dude. I'm just afraid for you. What are you talking about? Get away from me. I'll get away from you. I'll just follow you. Is that cool? No. And while that sounds kind of funny, can I tell you, I can introduce you to dozens of teens who will tell you, and their friend will tell you, that you saved my life that day. Because I was going to immediately go home, and I had a plan, and I knew what I was going to do, and I knew when I had to do it, and all the other things, da-da-da-da-da. And just little things like that. But if you know what to look for, if you know to get your antennas up and you know where to spot, all of a sudden, you have a life-saving opportunity. You got depression pieces. If you talk about depression, it only makes it worse. It's actually just the opposite. It's like, remember when you were a little kid and you turn the lights off and all of a sudden you would see a shadow in your corner and you're like, oh, I don't remember that monster being there, right? And you're kind of like, oh, I kind of freaked out or whatever. And you turn the light on and you're like, oh, okay, it's just the blankets and the shape or whatever. You're kind of, well, because when you put light on something, because darkness hates light. And when you begin to talk about something, Satan would love nothing more than be like, don't talk to anybody, do this by yourself, you don't need anybody, and he's going to try to get you to withdraw and keep you away from everybody. And realize that the more that you can engage and have the conversation and bring things out into the open, the better that's going to be. Teenagers are moody and don't suffer from real depression. That's dumb. I think most of us know that's a ridiculous myth. There's nothing anyone can do to help depressed teens. We have seen literally what would almost I believe truly is miracles, where God is moving through all kinds of situations. And it just doesn't mean going to a therapist and going taking drugs or whatever. There are so many different ways. Like, do you realize as depression is growing, there are so many different ways to approach helping people with depression. There are so many customized kinds of things to help for that, the way that person is and what they're dealing with. And there's not just some controlled substance that they shove down everybody's throat to fix them. That's not the way that it works. And when you have somebody who's really trained to help that person, they customize whatever that is to help them out. Telling a friend is depressed is betraying trust. We've talked about it. We know it's not true. Everyone experiences depression the same way. We know that's not true. All right, so how do you get it? So we talked about, your brain produces a number of different chemicals, but when your serotonin and norepinephrine levels decrease, that is the essence, that is the definition of depression. So when you see someone that you haven't seen in a while, and you run up and give them a big hug, and we refer to stuff like, we call it the warm fuzzies, or whatever term you want to use, that feeling that you get, those warm fuzzies, that's the release of serotonin in your body. That's where you get those warm fuzzy kind of feelings, and your brain produces those things. But when you have some kind of trauma in your life, whether you have a situation, whether it be chemical, it could come from a variety of different things, and all of a sudden, those two chemicals kind of get out of whack in your body, then all of a sudden, this is why people say, I've been praying to take this away for 10 years, and God, why won't you take it away? God's like, why won't you go talk to somebody? I've got 10 people around you who would love to help you, but you won't talk to anybody. The Bible's filled with these things called the one another's, and we are designed to be in life together with each other, living out the one another's. And so encouraging that piece as well. And as it relates to this, it's kind of like where diabetes is produces insulin. Diabetes doesn't produce insulin. Your pancreas and your liver are kind of in correspondence producing insulin, and those depression and your brain producing serotonin. But here's the difference. Only about 4% of people with diabetes as they go left untreated. But yet, as we talked about before, we're talking about 66% of teens suffering from clinical depression. Does that go untreated? Take a look at this brain. I always think of this. Remember that commercial? This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. That's what I always think. Okay, maybe I'm just. Thank you, Johnny. I see that hand. Right, perfect. But as you're talking about, this is a picture of somebody's brain when it's kind of firing on all cylinders, when it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So the person who's not depressed over here, you see all the colors, there's balance there, you see all the pieces, but yet when something happens because of a physical injury, a car accident, a concussion, or something else where it jostles their brain and they have a brain injury, and all of a sudden their brain's not producing the chemicals, lots of times, guess what two chemicals are some of the first ones to stop it or lower its production? Serotonin and norepinephrine. That's why oftentimes when someone's in a car accident, when someone's dealing with what they call post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's something that happened in their life because of, and this is something that I've struggled with. I can talk all about PSD, and I can talk to you more one-on-one if you want to know about that. But when you have that kind of trauma, whenever you have a trauma because of a memory, because of an experience, because of a physical trauma, then what happens is it messes with your brain so bad that you actually stop producing at the level that you should. And this is the danger. This is not a spiritual issue. Now, and there's all kinds of dynamics. Now, does Satan look for opportunities when we're down to kick us? Does Satan look for opportunities when we're struggling to say, hey, don't hang out with those friends. Don't go ask for help. Don't tell people how you feel. If you tell people how you feel, they're going to feel this way. They're going to look at you this way. They're going to look down on you, or people are going to think you're crazy. And that's what the accuser does, and try to keep us from talking, to communicating, to interconnecting. And one of the most powerful things that we can do, as we're talking about ripple effect, is to hit that where we begin to talk and that conversation goes on and on and on. And it just kind of lifts the veil off of that. So, what causes things to drop? We talked about PTSD, head injury. Weather can also affect that as well. It's called seasonal affective disorder. I lived in Michigan for 5 years. I promise you that that's real. That's a whole other story too. Childbirth, postpartum depression, hormone change, all of these pieces can play into in creating those serotonin and norepinephrine levels to drop. The PTSD at one time, Time magazine talked about that we were losing a soldier a day to suicide when they were coming back from the different wars. And that's all directly related to the PTSD and that trauma. The serotonin and norepinephrine levels. The concussion piece is a huge one. We're getting more and more conversation. These are all professional athletes who have committed suicide. And a lot of these are directly connected to this concussion piece. That's huge. But I will tell you, like for instance, the top two, Dave Duerson and Junior Seau, when they both committed suicide, I don't know about Dave Duerson's autopsy, but when they did Junior Seau's autopsy, and they measured him out, guess what two chemicals were dangerously low in Junior Seau? Serotonin, norepinephrine. You've got these different stories that have come out throughout the years, like Phoebe Prince and the bullying piece where she ended up committing suicide. And lots of times the bullying piece is a big topic. But let me boil it down to this. If you find someone who's struggling, you find someone who's kind of already at the edge of the cliff, who's kind of at that breaking point, and then you find another kid, another person who's feeling like they're insecure, they feel like if I can control somebody else, if I can make them feel bad, if I can make them do whatever, I'm going to feel in control, then who better to find than somebody who's kind of already at the edge of the cliff? And lots of times you will find these kids these bullies will find these students who are struggling with depression, or, and all these pieces, and that combination, it doesn't take much to push somebody over the edge. But make no doubt about it, it's not the bully that caused that kid to commit suicide. It was the depression. But again, it's one of those things we need to understand the circumstances there to be able to communicate that and to help the students so they don't get bullied, and to help bullies to be like, no, there's a way better way of dealing with that. You've got this piece. Look at this stat right here. And I know you guys are talking about this here in the next couple of weeks, but lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth are 4 times more likely, and youth that are questioning or would say, I don't really know what I am, are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide as their straight peers. And so I tell people this all the time. If you know a student, if you have a friend that you know that they would identify themselves in one of those areas, and you have a friend now that you know that is 3 or 4 times more likely to commit suicide, I'm hoping after today your antennas are up. Those conversations are going. And I always want to ask the question, man, but if there's nothing wrong with this and this is part of God's plan, then why does it end up like this? I mean, isn't there more? And people would say, well, there's, the stats, or it's because of all this other things, but the reality of it is when you step outside of God's protection, God wants more for us. And if you have a friend, hopefully you can come alongside of them in absolute love and to be able to just walk alongside them in the journey. The sexting thing, I've seen this mess up so many kids because it doesn't seem like a big deal to send pictures of their whatever to the whomever. And yet I've seen students commit suicide over the embarrassment of what they've experienced with all that. So let me round the corner here, we'll end. What does depression feel like? I asked a friend, I said, so does it feel like you're like in a dark room or you're kind of under a dark cloud? Listen to what he said. He says, no, when you're suffering from depression, it doesn't feel like you're in a dark room. He says it feels like you are the dark in the room. It doesn't feel like you're under a dark cloud. He says you feel like you are the dark cloud. And so when people come to you and tell you that, well, let's get you feel better, you're like, it's not about something feeling or anything else because it's not something, it feels like something I am, not something I have. And that's one of the difficulties. So when we're talking to someone, why people can't even imagine not feeling like this anymore. And I'm going to share a couple more things, but as I'm closing, I want you to begin to think about, I want to take a few minutes to have a conversation. I want to be able to answer and have a conversation about real life questions, real life things. If you've got situations, you have friends, if you have questions, please, I just want to plant these seeds right now as I finish this last point, and then we can have the conversation and do some Q&A. But like Owen Wilson talked about his depression before he's even the first attempted suicide, is, he would be what would be considered like more traditional kind. I'm sleeping a lot. I'm not very motivated to do anything. I'm I disconnected from my friends. I really don't want to hang out with anybody anymore. I'm spending a lot of time by myself. I'm really not motivated to do anything that I used to do. I stopped working out and I stopped doing my hobbies, and even the stuff that I was doing, I just was doing a crummy job, whether it be schoolwork or whatever it is. I mean, that would be one way, one expression of suicide. But Jim Carrey talks about his suicide almost on the other end of the spectrum. He talks about, instead of sleeping a lot, having trouble sleeping at all. And he's kind of agitated all the time. He talks about sitting in a hotel room for days at a time, screaming and cussing and throwing things at the television. And just being on edge and everything making him angry. And not knowing why he's angry, just knowing that he is angry. And you've got both of these guys suffering from the same disease, but it looks different for different people. We could put a third person right down their middle who's, instead of feeling sad or feeling angry, they're totally numbed out. And they don't feel anything. And lots of times it's in that when people are numbed out, they start messing around with stuff like self-injury. They start cutting and doing some of these other stuff. When the depression, they numbed out and they don't feel anything. It's almost like they feel disconnected from their life in general. So, as we're talking about balance, the different types of depression, what we realized is a study of 100,000 teens treated for depression said that there was a significant risk, a decreased risk of suicide within the first month of treatment. We know that when people get help, they change. When people get help, they move closer to wholeness, to health, which is God's design. And we know that this works. And this is why I just want to encourage you, and I hope that this is not a secret you want to keep, and your antennas are up because you're able to identify and spot different things after this. So, if you know someone struggling, you realize treatment's the key, talk about it. I mean, to help somebody understand that what they're experiencing is not their fault. You didn't deserve this. I mean, that could be huge. Encourage ongoing treatment. I mean, all of those pieces can be huge. On that handout, I've got a 4-step plan about how you can report suicidal content on Facebook. And that's on the back of that handout that I gave you. And we're working with Facebook, and Facebook has a whole a reporting piece where they report to the local police department and connecting if we know someone that's struggling with suicide. And we're still in process in developing that, but that's in process. So you've got the 4 steps there. And let me end with this. This is the last piece. 48 to 72 hours before somebody commits suicide, oftentimes they can have a massive swing in their emotions. They could go from being angry, sad, numb, whatever the case may be, to being almost hyper, to being like happy, to being affectionate. And they'll go around, and I've seen this time and time again, they'll go around and they'll be with their friends and they'll be hugging on them, and all of a sudden they're affectionate, they're like, and guess, what do you think their family's thinking? What do you think their friends are thinking when they make that shift like that? What do you think? Yeah, oh, they're better. Oh, good. They snapped out of it. And it's usually during this time period, where they write these very loving notes. Amber wrote 6 different loving suicide notes before she killed herself. They go in and they start giving away valuable possessions. Why would they give away valuable possessions? Why? They don't need any more, right? And it's in this place. That's why the majority of suicides that we come up on and we help people with, you hear this something to the effect of, I had no idea. I never saw this coming. And a lot of it is because they see this massive swing. But why would suddenly someone be happy before they kill themselves? Because they know that at this time, at this date, the pain's going to stop. They don't understand, they don't think about. I guarantee you, Amber had no idea the devastation that she would leave by taking her life. I mean, not only just with her and her family, but at our church and a lot of other pieces of the puzzle. But if we begin to come alongside and help and love people, this is huge. On the back of your handout here, you've got a lot of different dynamics. You've got, most importantly, I want you to make sure that you identify this as where can you go for help? We've got numbers here for the National Suicide Hotline. What's that? Youth Crisis Hotline, the With Hope Foundation, our phone number there, our website, SAVE, which is a suicide awareness, Voices of Education, all those pieces. And for those of you that are OCD and are mad that we didn't fill in the blanks, or you didn't want to do that, underneath there where it says answers, those are all the answers to fill in the blanks, and so you can fill those in and be happy about yourself, and everyone will go home cheery and happy about that, right? And one other piece is, if you are a pastor or a leader, I have one other document that I'd love to just give just for the leaders, and this is just a suicide risk assessment, and I can talk to you more about that if you'd be interested, but we can offer those for you as well. And if you want to know more about child share, I would love for you to grab a brochure, one of the things in the back, one of our newsletters. Those are for you to take with you and just for your information. But let's spend a few minutes just talking about how are you processing here? What are some of the questions? And I think we're gonna run a mic around a little bit. So and we want to make this, and if you can't think of one, but you think of a question that maybe people would want to ask, since we're going to put this online, I want to encourage you to ask it. Whatever question you think might be kind of left undealt with, and let's address those tonight, because let's create a great opportunity and great a piece to be able to help as many people as we can. So, any questions? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to assume that there's kids that you've experienced that have committed suicide are churched as well as non-churched.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't know whether they were believers or not, but they still struggled with the depression, regardless.
Right.
So my question is, as the church, are we addressing this at an early age? Are the kids not learning how to allow Christ to work in their lives? And I'm not pointing fingers at any churches. I'm just thinking how they're not knowing the Lord enough to be able to grasp onto that and to say, you know what, I'm just not feeling right, or something's wrong, or Lord help me. What's happening with that?
Yeah. Great question. And I know some churches that are hitting the ball at the park and doing this great, and I know some churches that need Jesus' help. And I think for me, honestly, the bottom line is the church is a place to create an environment for us to be real with where we are and who we are. And I think, in creating those environments is vital. And I think part of the challenge is a lot of the Christian kids, especially I'll talk about if I'm speaking at a Christian college or a Christian school, there's almost added pressure to have it all together, because it seems like everybody else that rolls up to your church has it all together except for you. I mean, I think that's one of the lies that Satan tries to pour into all of us. But yet, the more I think that we can, just be honest. I think some examples, I think we have more testimonies of people of things people are struggling with and not what they used to struggle with. I think that begins to change the dynamics. What comes from stage is that you don't have to have it all figured out before you step on stage. That's why when I started my story, I talk about my depression, my post-traumatic stress disorder, my baggage there is a plethora of that. And that's where I speak from, because one of my greatest desires in speaking and talking is to release people and go, well, that guy's totally screwed up, and he can do that, so maybe I can too, and it's my ministry to the church, But I really do think it's part of that thing. It's kind of like the guy that, I'll tell people, somebody who goes up there and says, well, you know, before I got saved, I was messing around and I was sleeping around and I partied and I did all this other stuff. But now that I'm saved, I got this incredible wife and incredible family, and man, praise the Lord, things are awesome. You know, and all the adults are going, oh, that's so wonderful, what a great testimony. And all the 17-year-olds going, yeah, so he totally got to screw around, and then he figured it out and didn't have any ramifications for his lifestyle choices, so let's party, this is killer. You know, and they're like, well, no, that's not what I meant. But I think we have to be aware of what we're communicating. And I think creating those environments of having people, and I say that because one of the things my wife and I will talk about, and it makes some people squirm if that's not the environment, is, you know, here's some things of how our past choices still affect our marriage right now at 23 years. And this is the ramifications for our choices. We can talk, and there are great, wonderful things, and God has healed and protected and done awesome things, but there are still these scars that we have that we're just and we're talking about where we are now and what we're struggling with now rather than what we used to struggle with. And I think creating that environment is vital. Yeah. Any other questions?
Is all depression clinical? And what is the process for healing? Is it certain medication, speaking to a person, a counselor, or what does it deal with during the healing process?
Across the board. Part of it is medical, some of it's circumstantial, some of it's situational, some of it's, and even then you can have two people who go through the exact same thing, but yet respond totally different and need totally different approaches even though they experience the same thing. You could have people who experience totally different things but have the exact same approach, and that's working for both of them. And we're talking about such a messy, complex piece. There's no, three-step process towards health. I think one of the big messages, and I thank you for bringing that up, is reminding us that it looks different for different people. There's no easy three-step process that makes everybody, there's fixed. There's like, well, it's just, I think that's a huge piece. And I think that's part of the challenge, because what we want with something so messy like this, and be like, oh, just give me something. But that's the great part, is when we see the treatment that people are getting, adults and students, and once they understand what are the components, what's their issue, how to, their response to this is what, and let's address those things, and let's move past the symptoms towards the problem, and let's, work towards the heart issue, let's work towards the health issue, and when those two things are dealt with, you've got a person in pursuit of health. And I think those are the dynamics, but I think the first step always is getting into that conversation, having a conversation about what's really there. Not what we ought to feel like, because I think lots of times we have this tendency to, want to say how we ought to feel, what we should think. And if we can move past that and get to what's really there, I think regardless of where anybody is, I think that's got to be the starting point of just that authenticity. And sometimes that's one of the hardest steps, is to get there. But I appreciate the question, but that's the challenge, I think, of exactly what it is we're talking about. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Well, I think they want to hear you so you can get on the video. And your question's too important to miss.
I just wanted to know if there was any difference between an actual suicide attempt and a cry for help, and what the, symptoms would be differ between the two.
Yeah, good question. A lot of people, and I think the inference there is somebody who's, kind of attempted suicide, but it doesn't seem like an aggressive attempt, or whatever. And the bottom line is simply this: you and I, and none of us are capable, and I don't think anyone would be able to say, well, I'm going to say that is just a cry for help and not really a suicide attempt. And so my whole piece is this: like when we ask the question, well, what if somebody's just trying to get attention, and they might not even attempt it, they're just telling people, and they're just doing that to get people's attention? One of the things that I really believe, and I've seen this work over and over again, if someone makes that kind of a statement, then let that statement get the attention it deserves. And if that person really is suicidal, they're going to get help. If that person isn't suicidal, they're really not going to like the attention that comes with that kind of statement. So I think, it's like, there's only one time when it's okay to be wrong, and that's if they're not suicidal. And so I think it's dangerous when we start to step in and go, well, maybe they're, if there's, I think we treat every single one of those like it's a life-saving, a life-threatening event. And then if it's a fake thing, they're not going to like the attention that comes from that. If it's a real thing, they're going to get the help they need. And so I think we just deal with every single one of those as a life-threatening one, rather than trying to play with the shades of gray that come with that. Even if it's not a physical attempt that they're doing, maybe it's just something they're posting on Facebook, or they tweeted something. I would deal with those things the same exact way. Even if we think it might be a cry for help, then let's get them some help. And then if, like I said, if it's real, great. And if it's not, they're probably not going to do that again. And I've seen that pretty consistent. People, with the kids that are maybe trying to use that as a tool to get attention, they're like, oh, I didn't like, that's not what I was going for with that whole thing. And they stop doing it, which is a good thing as well. So, but great question.
I had a parent that committed suicide when I was 12.
I'm sorry.
I have 4 boys. I find being a parent, struggling with it 28 years later, I'm always afraid to upset the apple cart. The difference between my husband, we disagree on it, because if they don't get what they want or get what they need or have, I can't let them just go to their room and be upset. I don't give them that space to, because instantly my brain goes, oh my God, they're upset. I gotta go in there because they're gonna do something crazy. Let me fix it. And I know that there's normal things for kids to be upset, teenagers. There's disappointment. How do you think it's, could it be like hereditary? Could it be, could I be encouraging it, I guess? Because when they're upset, I can't, I don't even know if I'm making sense.
Right. No,
We'll punish them, but the minute they're upset, I'm a totally different, I'm already there.
Yeah.
I've already played it out in my head. And my husband doesn't think like that because he hasn't dealt with suicide and how it can affect someone years down the road. And I've talked to my kids, they know about it. I don't even like it, toss the room. But there are consequences because I won't upset the apple cart.
Sure.
So I don't even know
Yeah.
what.
Well, no, I think there's 2 pieces that I'm hearing within your question. One is the idea is suicide is not hereditary, but depression can be. And so you can have, suicide can be passed down genetically. And so that's, again, you can have a family history of a lowered serotonin, norepinephrine. So there is that, the genetic piece that can come into play, that being aware of those things and identifying that. But also I think the piece for you is, like for instance, I'm 45, I've done therapy, I've been speaking on this, I've been teaching on this, I have a doctorate degree, I've kind of been down the road. And I'll tell you a story. I went to a friend of mine's a police officer. They came out with a new movie called, I think it was End of Watch. You know if you remember that movie? And so I got to go to one of these pre-screenings or whatever, and I went to this movie. And long story short is a lot of the scenes and everything in the movie were very near and right around where I grew up. And there was some child abuse kind of pieces in there, whatever. And anyways, I remember sitting there, and mentally and emotionally, I've got nothing going on. Physically, my heart started beating. I started getting really uncomfortable, and I could tell something was going on inside of me, but it wasn't a cognitive kind of. It wasn't something I was thinking about. It wasn't that I was feeling sad or scared. It was weird. It was like my body started doing stuff, and I realized that is just another indication of that post-traumatic stress for me. That stuff triggered, and it just ended up coming around the surface, which ended up for me getting connected with a therapist and kind of beginning to worry, all right, what was that? What happened there? And whatever. And so I would say, for you, just to make the connection with, you can't go through what you've gone through and not have some difficulties that come with it. Any human being, and for you to be at a place to have a healthy family, I'm going to claim health over all that, and the peace where you are, and you caring for your kids and all that. All of that's it's coming out of love, but it's also coming out of fear. And so I think the process that I would encourage, and for you, and just for yourself, I think you got to be okay in your own skin. and all those pieces, and the more that you get, with whether it be the 5 steps of the grief process or whatever, those kind of pieces. And sometimes that's not just one cycle that comes through. Like for me, I've been through lots of different cycles and everything else, and there's still things that keep popping up that I've taken it back to, or I'll end up barking at one of my kids and realize going, where did that come from? And realize that was probably more about me than it was about them. And, and so I just think my encouragement for you is in just processing, sitting down with somebody who can, help with you and just say, all right, how are you processing that? What is that doing? So when your son goes in the room and he slams the door and we know what the fear is, but where does that come from? How do you deal with that? So this is a long story, but I started doing a therapy a few years ago called EMDR, and I won't get on the details of all this stuff, but basically what was explained to me, and I love this explanation, is when you have a traumatic situation, and it's like your brain has, imagine like plumbing, and you've got all these thoughts and memories and all these things that are kind of moving back and forth, and you bring them to surface and whatnot, and then when you have a traumatic situation, it's like it sticks in the pipes, and it just gets stuck there. And that's why oftentimes when we have a trauma, we'll just relive that same thing, and that videotape will just be going over and over and over again, whatever memories we have around that. And then basically what EMDR does is they kind of go and help you begin to kind of dislodge the clog in the pipe, and so that memory begins to move, and you don't forget it, it doesn't go away, but you look back on it in a much healthier way, and then you don't respond to it in knee-jerk reactive kind of ways, because it's in a more proper place in our memory, and we process it differently. And I'm trying not to broadcast my junk on you, but I'm just saying, I know for me that's a piece that's a recurring theme, and that might be an opportunity that just might help, or making that connection as well. And because truly, when you lose a parent to suicide, when you lose anybody to suicide, I think that's the definition of trauma. Really, in a lot of different ways. So I don't know I hope that was helpful. Okay, well, let me do this. Can I close this in prayer? And then we can shift gears or whatever? All right, let's pray. God, thank you that you are not afraid of messy stuff. God, thank you that you meet us right where we are as we are. God, that we don't have to clean up before we come to you, but God, that you welcome us with open arms. Even if we have run away and we're making our way back, God, you meet us there. And God, even when we don't understand, even when we're frustrated, even when we're processing things like depression and mental health, and it's such a weird relationship that we have with you, Lord, and your word, and you, Holy Spirit, and all these other pieces of the puzzle, God, I pray that we would be a people that would just come before you and each other. And that, God, we would be honest with ourselves about where we are. God, that we could be honest with you about how we're feeling, just as Job was. And that, God, we would bring people around us, and we would have safe people around us to be honest with them as well. And God, I pray especially for those in tough situations, God, that you would give them strength to continue to walk strongly, to be seeking you, to bring their church family and their pastors and their friends around them that they could trust. And that, God, that we would truly realize, God, that Satan has no place here. That, God, these are your children. That you have bought them with a price. And that, God, you have adopted us as your children. And so you have the authority over our hearts and our lives because we have given them to you. And so, Lord, my prayer ultimately is that you would have your way with us. And God, help us to navigate difficult circumstances, difficult situations. And that, God, we would be able to pursue you and pursue health. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear how to help each other and how to help ourselves. And God, may you be the guiding force. God, you are the head, we are the body. And so may we listen and may we walk with you. And God, that we would just be aware that you were already there. God, we don't have to ask you to join us because you were there before we even got there. And so, God, I pray that we would just become more aware of your presence all around us all the time. And so, Lord, thank you so much for tonight. We love you and we thank you. And it's in your name we pray. And all the disciples said, amen. Amen. God bless you guys. Thank you.
Not to lighten that, but I recognized one thing tonight, and that's that when you normally put a pastor title in front of a guy's name, he talks a lot. But when you put Dr. Pastor in front of somebody's name, That dude can go. That was good stuff, right? Good stuff. Yeah, he deserves a lot of a round of applause. That's a really tough topic. The greatest encouragement that we have is that we were created in Christ for good works. So what do we do with this now? What do we do with this from here? So typically, we would break into some small groups, but we're running a little late and we don't want to hold people behind. So there's a couple of things that you can do. First off, if this brought up anything in your own life, if you have another question, a thought, a concern, you can see Vince. I'm sure he would love to stick around and share for a little while. You can see one of the other pastors in the room. Pastor Cliff, I know, was ready to do small group here. Aaron, as well as Tim back there. And they would be more than happy to answer any questions or step through any kind of struggle that you may be having right now. But really that we have been created for good works. It's now to go out and do something about it, right? We can talk about this until we're blue in the face. But unless we get out there and do something about it, none of those statistics are ever going to change. And so I would encourage you to find the person in your life that's struggling, to find those people in your life that you can tell those signs are there, and start asking questions. No one's going to hate you for loving on them. It may seem like that for a little while, but it'll eventually go away, and they'll love you a whole lot more later. So as we break up, like I said, if you have a question, you can speak to one of the pastors. They're more than willing to speak with you about that. Additionally, as Jim had said early on, if you'd like to share a little bit about maybe how this affected you tonight, maybe something that came to your mind, a past experience, we would love to have you join Pastor Jim and go back and just record a quick video clip. So as we continue to do these, we can encourage other people through your story and through some of the things that God put on your heart tonight. So that's that piece. Additionally, you guys have a paper here, and the same notes that are on this paper are on the Ripple Effects app in the suicide and depression category. And so I encourage you to get in there and to read up on those, so when you're approached with that situation, you're ready to have some conversations. When you don't know what to say, just ask a question, you know? Don't think that you have to have all the answers. And then lastly is you're invited back. So a month from today, Friday, July 18th, we're going to have a panel here. We're going to be at the same place, and we're going to be talking about the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender topic. So, you know, that rolls up into a lot of what's going on in society today with gay marriage and so many other things that are going on. And so we're going to have a panel of 2 men and 2 women that were at one point in the gay lifestyle, and since then God has rescued them from that lifestyle. And so they're going to share their story about how that's affected them and how they're stepping through that now. So I invite you to come back, to invite a friend. I hope you enjoyed yourself tonight. I know this is a very difficult topic, but we trust that God had you here for a purpose and that you're going to be able to do good work through that. So let me go ahead and pray for just our night as we go off. Father God, we are grateful that above all else that we were created by you, for you, and you will, God, return one day to restore this whole world to yourself. God, one day there will not be any more depression or suicide or struggle. God, we will be living in paradise. And until that point, God, I pray that you would protect us. God, that you would equip us. God, that you would give us opportunities, God, to meet these people where they are. God, or to meet us where we are. If we're the ones struggling, God, I pray that you would bring someone into our lives, God, that was loving and caring enough to ask us questions. God, and that we would feel comfortable enough, God, to open up and to share. Because I think at some point or another, God, we have all felt those signs, whether clinical or otherwise. God, thank you that we serve a mighty, mighty Savior. We thank you for this team. God, we thank you for Grace Church, Orange County. We thank you for Pastor Randy that couldn't be here tonight. Thank you to Pastor Vince and for everybody, God, that put effort forth to be here. And so we just pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.